It is a plain fact that there have been, in my area of expertise, which is Jack Kennedy's medical evidence, 5 groups fundamentally that have looked at the medical evidence, autopsy evidence, some of them have seen the autopsy photographs and x-rays, and have concluded overwhelmingly, not completely, but overwhelmingly, that the wounds are consistent with Oswald having been the assassin, shots from above and behind, and multiple groups of really quite accomplished specialists have agreed with this. We had some of them in the audience today, in the last few days. Michael Bodden, former coroner of New York City, being perhaps the most vocal proponent for the single assassin theory. What I discovered, and I have on the web now at a website called historymatters.com, is a very lengthy essay which I summarized in my remarks yesterday. And the fact is that from the outset of the assassination, the conclusions were drawn by J. Edgar Hoover on the night of the assassination that Oswald had done it alone. There are memos to that effect. He then sent his agents to confirm his conclusion reached before the investigation. They, of course, reported back, yes, boss, you were right. We then, because this is under the auspices of the Justice Department, the autopsy report is done, and the autopsy report starts coming into some question in the middle 60s. Thereupon, the Justice Department very quietly starts organizing what they said was an attempt to spike calls for a wide-ranging investigation of the whole case by focusing on the autopsy evidence, and they do that by getting the original autopsy surgeons, who by all accounts did a lousy job of the autopsy, and having them look at the materials and saying, did you do a good job? And of course they reported back, we did a wonderful job. So they, looked at their old navel, they said it looks wonderful in here, and that was supposed to satisfy skeptics. It didn't work, so then the Justice Department was forced to seek independent counsels. But it, again, organized all this, and from declassified memos that came out only in the 1990s, we found what they were telling their experts. Now, they were men with impeccable credentials. I mean, I'm not going to say they weren't, chairmen of departments in various places. But the memos show, and from their own writings, they show that Ramsey Clark, the Attorney General, told them, listen, your job is to come in here and debunk some of this stuff that Warren critics are saying. And so it is evident from the quality of their work, which is very shoddy from men of estimable credentials, that they didn't take the project very seriously. They made silly errors, both in reading the x-rays and saying where the wounds were on photographs and x-rays. And every interpretation or misinterpretation, as we now know, on the basis of not just my evaluation of this, but the evaluation of subsequent examiners, that the early examiners made whopping errors. And these are on the basis of the conclusions of ultimately very credentialed experts in other groups. But consistently, all their errors tended to be in an error in one direction, and that is Oswald did it. In 1975, after there had been some revelations of CIA abuses, Gerald Ford, who was a former Warren Commission member, impaneled the so-called Rockefeller Commission because he made his Vice President, Nelson Rockefeller, the chairman of this commission, to look into CIA abuses. And part of that was the allegation that had been made the CIA had been involved in the assassination of Jack Kennedy. And so they looked at the autopsy evidence to see if there were evidence of shots from the right front, because perhaps a couple of CIA agents might have been shooting from there, as had been alleged. And so who did they pick to investigate the autopsy evidence, or investigate, to be the executive director of the Rockefeller Commission, but a former Warren Commission counsel and a real pit bull for the Warren Commission, David Bellin. So here you have a Warren Commissioner who is the President of the United States nominating as his executive director of an investigation former Warren Commission counsel to look into the Warren Commission's conclusions. And so not terribly surprising that you would get that. And of course then they selected the specialists. And right away in the 70s, Dr. Cyril Wecht pointed out in a press release that got some coverage that all the people that they were picking were people who had been previously associated with either the government or the institutions that had provided the original people to do the autopsy work, and sure enough they were. And again, what we found, not my conclusions, but the conclusions of other experts who have looked at this subsequent to that for the House Select Committee on Assassinations, their work was extraordinarily sloppy, and consistently sloppy along the lines of always making errors that pointed the finger of guilt back at Lee Harvey Oswald. You know, as simple matters, perhaps a little detailed, but they said that the trail of fragments in the X-ray, for example, pointed to where they assumed the in-chute was. Well, it turns out they don't point there at all. But that was supportive of the idea that Oswald had done it, and so they went along with that idea, and they made other surprisingly misinterpretations of the data. They say that there's no movement of the limousine occupants before Kennedy gets hit in the head with a bullet at the famous Zapruder frame 313. Well, there's a lot of movement of the limousine occupants at around 236, 237. The governor sitting right in front of Jack Kennedy is hit and moves visibly, jerks around in reaction to his shots, and is pulled down to the seat before Kennedy takes the headshot. How could somebody, particularly a government investigator, have looked carefully at the film and have reported that? It wasn't publicly available then. No one was able to check his facts there, and I think he assumed that that nobody would check their facts. And so these sorts of facts, they misread the X-rays, they misread the autopsy photographs, they misread the physical evidence, and with each mistake, the mistakes just so happened to coincide with supporting Oswald's guilt. So we then, in terms of exploring this, came forward to the investigations of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And again, this is extraordinarily brief summary of what is written on the web right now at over 100 pages. And the House Select Committee on Assassinations came up and again made appalling errors, did not interview important witnesses, although they got a lot of the things right that had been gotten wrong in previous investigations. Perhaps their biggest failing is that as an organization, the House Select Committee on Assassinations had a real serious problem. Kennedy was shot in Dealey Plaza, taken to a hospital where a team of very experienced trauma specialists examined him and said he had a hole in the back of his head. Well, the autopsy photographs don't show a hole in the back of the head. They show an intact back of the head, virtually not a hair out of place, a little red spot which they said was a wound of entrance toward the top of the skull. Well, what was the House Select Committee going to do with this very distinct contrast? And so it reported in one of its volumes that they had resolved the problem, and they had done that because they'd gone off to interview the witnesses who had been at the morgue. Now, certainly people who were involved in a resuscitation, people who are emergently trying to keep Jack Kennedy alive, may not be as good witnesses as people who are standing around a morgue for 4 hours. And so they said, well, we have shown that the Parkland doctors were wrong because we interviewed the 26 witnesses who were present in the morgue, and all of them have endorsed the photographs that show no defect in the back of the head. Therefore, the Dallas doctors are wrong. But when they published their report in 1978, they didn't release the interviews that they'd taken with these people from the morgue who were witnesses to the autopsy. They didn't release diagrams they prepared. After the JFK film came out and an outrage was elicited from the public that all these documents were still being held in secret, out tumble those documents. So we look at what these people said in the morgue, and all the people in the morgue said the same thing the Dallas doctors said. And they drew diagrams, they gave very explicit testimony. The right rear quadrant of the head is missing, for example, is one of the quotes. And we're not just talking about technicians, although the technicians said that as well. We're talking about generals in the morgue and other people, high-ranking physicians that were there. Oh yeah, the right rear quadrant of the head. The mortician that prepared the head for burial said, oh yeah, there's a hole square in the back of the head. So now there was a real conflict between the autopsy photographs and what not only the Dallas doctors had said, but also what the witnesses in the morgue had said about Kennedy. It was a big black eye when I first revealed this to the House Select Committee members, because everyone denied having written that false passage. But it just, again, so happened that this mistake helps support the case against Oswald. Again, the mistakes always seem to go in one direction. They don't seem to ever fall in the direction of getting Oswald off the hook. So then the question arose about the autopsy photographs. But again, and this is another huge finding for us, the House Select Committee reported that it had authenticated the autopsy photographs. And the authentication consisted of looking for internal consistencies. But it reported, quite falsely, that it had not been able to get the autopsy camera that had been used to take the autopsy pictures, and so it wasn't able to completely close the loop on the fact that they were, authentic, but they noticed internal consistencies which supported the theory that they were authentic. Well, that was very good until the declassified documents tumbled out. And it turns out that, in fact, they had gotten the autopsy camera. And they tested against the autopsy pictures, and they didn't match. And, in fact, it raised a bit of a stink between the House Select Committee on Assassinations and the Department of Defense. Because there was a letter that was reproduced, sent by the House Select Committee back to the Department of Defense under the autopsy was done at the Naval Hospital, the Department of Defense Hospital. And in a kind of a snippy letter, they wrote back saying, we'd like you to find the real camera because the camera we have here does not match the autopsy pictures. We've done tests, they don't match. And so a fellow named Hester, who was an Assistant Secretary of Defense, wrote back saying, that is the only camera of its kind that was ever used at the hospital. You have it. Well, the fact that there was this mismatch was withheld from the record. I mean, it did not protect in any way national security. It wasn't an important secret, but it undermined the case that they were deciding they were going to make to kind of keep Oswald in the box as an assassin. And it also, tended to support the idea that the autopsy photographs were accurate representations because not only had they been endorsed by the autopsy witnesses who in fact had refuted them, they'd been validated, which they never had been. So what can we say about the autopsy photographs? Well, several things. One is, all of the people who were involved in taking the autopsy photographs say that the photographs they took are missing. And they didn't just say that afterward. They said that even in Warren Commission testimony. They described saying, oh, we took a photograph of this, we took a photograph of that. When finally the photographs are seen publicly, and I've seen the originals at the National Archives, those images are not in the collection. They then later testified when they were brought at other times to view the photographs. Look, we took a picture of the interior of the body. There is no photograph of the interior of the body. We took pictures of the skull wound. There are no pictures of the skull wound they said they took. There are people who developed pictures at for the government after the autopsy who said, we saw pictures that later vanished. So there are serious questions about Jack Kennedy's autopsy record, not only because consistently has the government selected experts who would help support its case, and embarrassingly did so, people with wonderful credentials, who either by inattention or sloppiness made the sorts of errors that always ended up at errors that supported the government's position about Oswald, or later frankly falsified the record. The biggest embarrassment was the fact that they left perhaps the most important medical witness uninterviewed, unasked. They left him completely out of the loop. Who was that? It was a fellow named Dr. George Berkeley. He was the president's personal physician. He was in the motorcade when Kennedy was shot. He was with the president when he was taken to Parkland Hospital and they tried to save his life. He flew with the body on an airplane back to the morgue. He was in the morgue and traveled up and down between the morgue and the 17th floor of the hospital to visit with a family, but was there the whole time. He was never brought in for an interview. By the Warren Commission, by the Rockefeller Commission, by the Clark panel, by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and he was privately telling people and publicly telling people that he thought there was a conspiracy. So here's somebody who is probably, the best witness, medical witness to all the events, with the broadest reach and the most familiarity with Jack Kennedy as a person. He's not even brought in to be interviewed. It's an appalling lapse, to say the least.